name is Grehan and I am Operations Manager with TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland. I am delighted to have been asked to take part in this conversation about the inclusion of LGBTQI plus people in sport. I think it's a really timely, important conversation to be having. And what I want to talk about today is just a little bit around the participation of transgender people in particular in sport. I want to try and be as helpful as possible, so I'm going to go through a little bit around the kind of definitions and language, because I think that might be an area where people sometimes feel maybe apprehensive or nervous, and then offer some suggestions on how to be a good trans ally and how to be inclusive of trans people when it comes to sport. I hope it's helpful. I'm very conscious of my lockdown beard, and I'm also very conscious of the fact that I talk too much, so I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. And I'm also going to need to look down a couple of times just to check my notes. So first of all, I suppose it would be helpful to give you a definition of what the word transgender means. I think this is something where people sometimes feel like they have an idea but might not completely understand. So our definition of transgender at TENI is that a transgender person is anybody whose gender identity or gender expression is different to the sex that they were assigned at birth. So when I talk about sex, what I mean is what someone is assigned at birth based on their biology or their anatomy and what is recorded on their birth certificate. Your gender identity is your deeply felt internal sense of your own gender, of feeling male, female, or another gender. And your gender expression is how you outwardly manifest your gender to the world. That may not always be a conscious thing, but we live in a very gendered society, and as human beings, we have developed this ability to navigate this gendered society by picking up on clues that other people give us about their gender. So just to come back to my definition of transgender and TENI's definition of transgender is a transgender person is anybody whose gender identity, their deeply felt internal sense of their own gender, or their gender expression, how they outwardly manifest that gender to the world, is different to the sex that they were assigned at birth. I am a cisgender person. That means that the sex I was assigned at birth, male, matches my internal sense of my own gender, which is also male. And we use the word cisgender as an adjective just to describe people who are not trans. It means the opposite of transgender. It's an adjective and it's not really an identity. I wouldn't usually describe myself as a cis man unless it's in the context of talking about transgender people. That's usually the only occasion where it's relevant. The other word other term I kind of wanted to throw out there is the phrase non-binary. And I think more and more people have heard the phrase non-binary, and in fact you'll often see transgender and non-binary written together more and more commonly now. And what non-binary means is it's an umbrella term that covers anyone's identity that doesn't fit within a male or female box. So it's anyone who doesn't simply identify as male or female is a non-binary person. A non-binary, as I said, it's an umbrella term. It covers lots of different identities under that umbrella. But what it does mean is those people do not identify as male and they do not identify as female. Being non-binary can mean that you feel like a different gender altogether. It can mean that you experience fluidity in your own gender, so you can flow from feeling one gender into another and then back again. It can mean that you've maybe feel a mixture of genders. It's very individual and particular to people, and people use lots of different language to describe themselves, but as a practical kind of umbrella term, non-binary is a very good positive term, and non-binary people use the word or the phrase non-binary to describe themselves and are happy to be described as non-binary. So it's just a handy one to have. So if we do need to describe people or put people in categories, if you've got male, female and non-binary, you've got a box for everybody. I'm not a big fan of putting people in boxes, but I do understand sometimes it is necessary and we have to kind of have practical ideas of how to do that. So that was all I wanted to talk about kind of on the language front. And now I wanted to talk a little bit around kind of some of the suggestions we have on how to be a good trans ally. And so I'm going to go through kind of a list of do's and don'ts as quickly as I can, because I can already see I'm at 4 minutes on this video. So first of all, my first do is to respect someone's name and pronoun. I think it's really important to respect someone's identity, and if they're telling you who they are, that you take them at face value and you accept them for who they are. If you're not sure of what pronoun to use for a person, it's okay to ask respectfully. Like if you need to know and you need to use that person's pronoun and you're not sure, it's okay to ask respectfully what someone's pronoun is. Respect someone's privacy. Some trans people are out, some people aren't, but someone telling you they're trans is quite sensitive information, so maybe don't share that with everybody unless you really need to tell somebody that they're trans, and tell somebody that someone you're working with is trans. And if you do, try and involve the trans person in that conversation to make sure that they understand that their identity is being shared with someone else. So as you would with anyone basically, or with any kind of sensitive information, don't share it with just anybody or talk about somebody behind their back. I think a key thing about being a good ally, and particularly around sports organisations, is to have some kind of policy in place in order to ensure that trans people are able to participate in sport, and that also coaches and people involved in that organisation who are volunteering or who are working know what they can do to support a trans person. I think having a policy is a crucial framework in which you can make sure that the inclusion of trans people happens in sport. I think it gives confidence to everybody. It makes people feel like they have a little bit more knowledge and they understand what the steps are in terms of including a trans person in sport. So when I talk about a policy in sport, I mean in terms of like, what is your organization's stance on transgender people, on diversity, on inclusion, and I think to name that is really important, and then to put in practical steps. And I would suggest having things like suggested conversations. So if somebody comes out to you as trans, what do you do in that situation? What's appropriate to ask, what isn't? Things like if somebody wants to transition and they're already on one team and they want to move to a different gendered team, how could that be managed? Can it be managed? What's the best way of doing that? Communicating with other people, maybe if it's a team sport, in terms of how that communication might be managed. Just practical considerations, you know, if changing rooms, bathrooms, all of these things that tend to crop up in these conversations. Having a policy in place that gives people clear guidelines gives everyone confidence in a sense of an understanding of what can happen and what's possible. I have some don'ts as well, and then I'm nearly finished, I promise. Try not to use gendered language. So if you're talking to a group, maybe say everyone instead of guys or girls. I think that's a good one. When it comes to sport, maybe be conscious of some of the health concerns that trans people may have. A trans man, for example, may be binding his chest, which means wearing a very constrictive binder to flatten his chest. And that can cause problems with people's backs. It can cause, problems with people's breathing. So just to be aware that might be an issue for somebody. Or if you see someone in a changing room and they have a kind of, what looks like a very tight, almost swimsuit on under their clothes, that you know what that is. That's a binder, and that's what that's doing. Also to be patient. I think for a lot of trans people, they may not have engaged in any kind of sport since they were in school maybe, and so it may take them a while to kind of get into it and get used to it and kind of get their fitness back to where it used to be. So be patient with transgender people who are coming in to kind of engage in sport. Don't assume that you'll always know someone is trans by looking at them. That's a myth, that people assume that you can always tell somebody is transgender by looking at them. You can't, or you won't be able to tell somebody is trans by looking at them necessarily. And trans people all are quite diverse and look quite different. So there is no one particular way to be trans or to look trans. Don't ask people about surgery. Don't ask people about their genitals. I mean, that's maybe just a good rule for life in general. I think one of the areas where it's difficult around sport is that there aren't guidelines, there aren't policies in place, and there's a lack of education. And I would really suggest that getting some kind of education on transgender lives, on the lived experience of trans people, would be really helpful. So I firmly believe that policy and education are the way forward when it comes to making sport more accessible and more inclusive. But one of the things, when there isn't a policy in place and when people lack guidelines, they look at what guidelines do exist. And often what that means is that people are looking at professional sport organisations or even the Olympic Committee's guidelines on transgender people. Now those are for professional athletes, and they tend to focus very much on surgical or medical interventions that somebody has had. But that's not suitable in like kind of your local GAA club context. Like, I don't suggest that any, coach or person running a sports club asks anyone about their surgical or medical history. I don't think that's appropriate. But in the lack of any kind of like practical day-to-day guidelines, often people turn to that with the best will in the world because they have no other guidelines to follow. So what that means is that like an incredibly high bar is being set for trans people's participation in sport, because they're being asked to kind of meet Olympic or professional athlete standards in order to just go and join their local soccer team. And I think that's one of the dangers of not having a policy that works for people, is that then whatever is there is what's kind of taken as being the best guidelines, and then trans people are held to a really high standard. I have so much to say, but I'm already nearly at 10 minutes and I think this video is probably too long. Please engage in the Q&A. I'd love to answer more questions. I hope this was helpful, and thank you so much for your time.